Hello, and you're very welcome to our Ask the Author session on Ready for Takeoff, integrating drones into the transport system. For those of you who don't yet know our Ask the Author format, it's a very short 30-minute session in which we will present the main findings of our latest report on drones to you and then open the floor to you to take your questions. The most important housekeeping rule to bear in mind is that to pose your questions, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window. Do not use the chat function, we can't see that. So use the Q&A, and even from now, you can already put your questions to us. So we are joined today by the lead authors of the report on drones. That's Elisabeth Windisch and Katja Schechtner. Elisabeth will start the presentation with our key findings, and then we'll open the floor for your Q&A. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Elisabeth.
Thank you, Ronan, and hello to everyone. So I will give you a short presentation about the content of the work, and then my colleague Katja will also be there to answer any questions or comments that arise at the end of the presentation. Ready for takeoff, integrating drones into the transport system. Our report focuses on, as the name says, integrating drones into the transport system. So we do not address any specific safety or security questions, for example, but we really look about the broader transport system and what drones mean for that. The motivation and background of this work. So the main question we wanted to address is, how do we prepare for a large-scale deployment of drones? Because we see that there are many public concerns that go much beyond safety and security that still need to be addressed. There are many worries in the public what drones would actually mean for them and for the transport system overall. And we also see that current regulation is still too restrictive or lags behind, and it's not fit for purpose for the uptake of drones. This is mainly because current regulation is based on aviation regulation that is already out there, but this is not really what we need for drones. But first of all, what do we actually mean by drones? So drones in the context of this work include all sizes and weights. They include all design layouts or engine types, so whether, for example, they run on conventional fuels or on electric motors. This is irrespective of the altitude at which they operate. The only limitation, so to say, that we have in terms of drones is that the drones we look at must be relevant for the transport sector. So either they cover passenger or freight transport, or they support the transport system by, for example, helping in maintenance of railways, bridges, rail tracks, or so on. We looked at the market potential of drones and the economic impact. So basically, this answers the first question: is it actually relevant, or should we even look into drones and what it means for our economy? We then also looked into the societal impacts and acceptance of drones, environmental impacts, drone infrastructure. Here we address specifically the questions about how should infrastructure be governed and funded. And then the very relevant question of how do we integrate drones into the existing transport system? Again, and very importantly, because this comes up very often, not part of our work is are any safety or security questions. So the starting point of this work really is, or was, what if drones are safe to fly? How do we then deal with them in order to make sure they actually serve the economy as a whole? What we found, first of all, very relevant points, which basically gives justification to carry out this work, is that drones enable a significant economic activity and can deliver substantial, not only economic, but also social and environmental benefits. But in order to do so and to really reap the benefits that drones can provide, we need to adapt existing regulations. And as said before, existing regulations currently come out of the aviation industry, but this is insufficient to leverage the benefits of drones, and are just not fit for purpose for drones, because drones maybe also be flying objects, but actually they serve quite different purposes. So you should not necessarily think about the aviation industry or aviation policy making when you think about the uptake of drones. There are also substantial knowledge gaps that remain that will be, well, we need to close these gaps in order to make sure that policy making in this context is actually, again, fit for purpose and can address all the public concerns that still exist. Now let's move on right away to some of the high-level key policy recommendations that come out of this report. So first of all, drones really, the status of drones really needs to be clarified within the context of airspace regulation. Drones have many more use cases than what we may think when you think about the traditional aviation industry. Obviously, we think about drones in terms of parcel deliveries, as this has already to some degree taken off. But there are also use cases in terms of urban air mobility, for example, but also drones that fly like conventional aircraft, and therefore would maybe fit into this airspace regulation. But the use cases for drones are much, much broader than what we currently know from traditional aviation industry. And this is also the reason why drone authorities in the future should be equipped, so to say, with interdisciplinary competencies. So they should not only be people coming from the aviation industry, but also urban planners, transport modelers, transport economists, and so on, to make sure a drone system within the broader transport system will actually work. There needs to be clear objectives and priorities for the introduction of drones. So this first phase will be really very essential to make sure that there is public acceptance and drones can actually take off. So at the beginning, it would be wise to focus on use cases of drones where there is a clear public benefit of drones. Like, for example, we saw during the COVID crisis, where medical deliveries could be carried out in a contact-free environment. So these are the kind of things, the use cases with which policymakers could start first. There should be a close coordination with the drone industry, because drone industry has been actually working on drones for quite a while and has been carrying out a lot of drone trials around the world. So whenever an authority is thinking about policy making for drones, they should really coordinate with industry here, who have gained in the last decade actually already a lot of relevant experience in how to cope with drone deployment and how to bring also the public on board. Another very relevant point is dedicated to urban transport planners, urban authorities, because we see now that there's a lot of pressure on urban areas, a lot of, because of increasing urbanizations, because of all the environmental impacts of our transport systems, all the increasing demand of reducing CO2 from our transport systems. So there's a lot of urban planning going on of how the city should look in the future. And in this context, policymakers should really not forget about thinking about drones, because this will very likely be part of our urban transport systems in the future. Furthermore, policymakers should think about how to implement a robust unmanned air traffic management system. So this system can have many different purposes, and policymakers should first of all be aware of what so-called UTM systems can have, and then think about what their specific system maybe should be carrying out, and how, again, this can support the drone system itself, but maybe also have wider benefits to the public for other purposes that these UTM systems can fulfill. And then, and I want to emphasize this point, there should be a very clear communication strategy that is set up to address public concerns. And this is not only an add-on, but this should basically be a starting point for public authorities when they design the drone policies, because we see that with a proper communication strategy, a lot of the public concerns that have arisen already, that will be arising necessarily, can actually be addressed. This may range from concerns of equity issues, privacy issues, noise issues. There are a lot of these issues that can actually be addressed by communication strategies. So not any technical or any specific policy solutions, but just by a communication strategy that makes sure the public is on board with drone deployment. And then something on the environmental perspective. So public authorities should make sure that the impact of drones is assessed across the full life cycle. So this does not only concern energy consumption and related CO2 emissions, but also what is the impact on wildlife, what is the impact on noise, what is the impact on public health, on the health of every citizen in urban, but also rural areas or wherever the drones will be deployed. So these are some of the very high-level recommendations that come out of the report, but we have in each subchapter a lot of more detailed recommendations. And I would like to go into two of them a bit more to give you a flavor of the wealth of policy options and recommendations you can find in this report. And I will focus first on the issue of privacy, because we think that this is one of the main concerns that the public currently has with regards to drone deployment, and the other one is about noise. So first, let's start off with the privacy issue. What can policymakers do to alleviate a bit the privacy concerns that surround drone deployment? First of all, they can advise drone operators on how to mitigate such concerns. And these concerns, most importantly, will not only come up with drones that are actually equipped with cameras and are therefore collecting data when they, for example, fly across motorways or so, but every citizen who will see a drone flying above their heads will likely have this concern that this drone may be equipped with a camera and may be there to collect data. So there will have to be a strategy how these concerns can be addressed. For example, there could be no-fly zones over residential areas or no-fly times over specific areas. There could also be mandatory registration and remote identification of drones. So this, for example, means that a person that sees a drone and does not know what the drone is for could log on the web and check what the purpose of this specific drone flying over the head is right now. And if they, for example, then get to know that this drone is flying to bring a blood sample from a hospital to a certain lab, then public acceptance of this drone may, for example, increase substantially. Again, and as I said it before, communication here is very important to foster public acceptance. For a specific service, authorities could assess with the drone operator what is the drone actually allowed to collect while carrying out a drone operation, assess with the drone operators what could be potential mitigation pathways to alleviate privacy concerns. For example, avoiding certain areas, avoiding certain residential developments where the drone should not fly over. And it will always be very relevant, and there also a lot of responsibility will come to the drone operators to actually inform the public in the vicinity of the service. So this was to privacy. Now about noise issues and noise concerns. So here, a very important concept to understand is that actual noise can actually be very different from the perceived noise. And this is especially a big topic in terms of drones, because drones have a higher pitched noise than what we typically know from other transport services, which is unknown to us. And drones themselves are a bit unknown to us still. So therefore, the noise that we perceive is actually much higher currently than the actual noise that a drone emits. So there should be research, continuous and more research on this topic to see what technical solutions actually exist to reduce the actual drone noise, but also how people perceive this drone noise and why it is so differently perceived and what can be the mitigation options for that. There could also be a drone noise monitoring and reporting system put in place, something similar to what is currently done in urban areas when we talk about air pollution, for example. There could be low noise flight procedures because some maneuvers with drones cause more or less noise than others. So there should also be some more research into that, for example. And there could be drone operating restrictions during certain times of the day, for example. And there should be a staged approach to drone integration because, again, the more the people know about the drone service and the slower it goes, so to say, and the more people come step by step aware of drones, all these issues will actually alleviate itself, so to say, from some point onwards. This brings me already to the end of the presentation of the content of this work. I want to now take a minute to thank all our working group members that participated in this work, that authored the work. We brought together more than 30 practitioners and academics from more than, from 14 countries and 3 intergovernmental organizations. We also want to thank the corporations that provided inputs in our industry consultation efforts, specifically Martinet, Lilium, and Airbus, who came to our working group meetings to present their work. And a specific thanks also to Richard Cross from the Ministry of Transport in New Zealand, who chaired this working group after Laura Ponto could not take on this responsibility anymore in the first half of this working group experience. So thank you to all of you for contributing. Thank you also to our audience here today for listening. We are now here ready for your questions and comments. As said before, this is me and my colleague Katja Schechtner, who also facilitated and authored this working group report together with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for a very succinct and in-depth overview of the report. From now, please don't hesitate to send us your questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom window. We already have a few questions coming in, so we'll get started right away. First question is from Thorsten Indra, who I think is from the drone private industry side, who picks up on your comment about education. Thorsten asks, how do we best go about educating the public and hesitant politicians in order to raise public acceptance? And Thorsten makes the point that demos are rather costly, and do they need the buy-in of authorities in terms of permissions, etc.?
Thank you.
Either Katja or Elisabeth would like.
I think I will take this question. Yeah. Well, I agree that the demos will be rather costly, but I think a lot can be done by information campaigns, by so-called co-creation processes with the public. There are good examples that have been going on already in Germany. You can find examples of this also in our report, where really the public was engaged to develop basically with the drone operator how the drone service could look, to design with the drone operator where the drone should ideally fly for a certain service that had very clear benefits also to the public, so that then the public was aware of what is going on. Obviously, this is always a very small scale project, and you can't do this broadly across all drone use cases, but this is exactly why at this very early stages, such a focus should be given to engaging the public and informing them properly. You will find a few more specific recommendations and also these references to how some German cities went about this in our report.
Great, thanks, Elisabeth. A next question in from Geert van Wegen, who asks, did you take cognitive overload into consideration? And I presume Geert means from the point of view of the drone, as he says, as a pedestrian, should I be looking upwards to avoid unpleasant interactions or crashes with the drone?
Yeah.
Should I take that, or
yes.
Should you?
Katja, please go ahead.
As urban has been a little bit of my focus in this work. Thanks, Gerd. This is a typical question that we receive, and this is a typical question why we authored this report on public acceptance. Now, you ask a question about safety, and as we said in the beginning of the report, we assumed that drones would be safe, which is a prerequisite to even allow them up in the air and flying. But it's not everything that needs to be taken under consideration, especially when you think about looking up in the air when you walk through cities. The question becomes more about noise, as Elisabeth has discussed, about also vibrations. And also what has been really a focus of our topic is that we have to come up with very specific regulations tailored to the urban morphology, the culture, how cities look like in different societies. Think about the high-rise flat roofs in the US or in the Middle East or Asia versus a more traditional European city. So where would be landing points? Where would be how far below? So how high could drones fly? Where could they drop down? There is a discussion ongoing on the access to public space. Should drones be allowed to access public space wherever? Should they integrate with more public transportation services already? And one of our key recommendations when we look especially at urban and urban air mobility, and we benefited a lot from interacting with Hamburg and the experts from Hamburg in this question, who came into this group as part of an urban air mobility initiative by the EU with many cities, is that you should come up with a concept for drone ports that's relevant for your specific city. One of the key questions in this area then, of course, becomes how do you regulate drone transportation on a national versus a subnational, regional, or even a community or urban regulatory body? And this is something that's still ongoing, if we think about that. Okay, thanks. I think that's my answer to this.
Thanks very much, Katja. Before our next question, we're going to launch a quick poll. This is to help us to understand whether these sessions are useful for you and whether you find them interesting. So Ande, if you can release the poll now. 2 quick questions, we'd be very grateful of your feedback. A question on the overall societal benefits from David Moncholi. How do you value the positive impacts of drones on a social level? And his example is, what about drivers of delivery companies who will no longer be perhaps necessary anymore if drones are doing the delivery? Will they convert into drone operators?
I will take this question. Well, positive societal impacts of drones, there are actually quite a few. So we can think about connectivity to remote regions, for example, which is a subject in our societal part of the report. So you can imagine that some remote regions have very poor connectivity. This means that they're deprived from job opportunities, access to healthcare, and so on. And it is often very difficult to provide the necessary infrastructure because this is very costly. So if they could refer them to a drone service, which could provide not only freight deliveries, but also passenger mobility in the long term, this could actually come to a very, very high societal benefit. Another example is accessibility also in urban areas, where potentially congestion could be beat by drones. However, this immediately comes with basically the warning that in that case, we as transport planners and modelers know that typically increasing capacity does not necessarily mean reduced congestion. And also that increased accessibility in urban areas may come with increased urban sprawl. So there's a warning on that, but this means at the same time, or shows the importance of policymaking here, and that the right policy measures are put in place, that really these benefits can be materialized, while potential externalities that you don't want to materialize can be kept in check at the same time. Then on there was a sub part of the question more related to job losses. As with any new innovation technology, or with many of them, I think you shouldn't speak about job losses, but rather job shifts from one industry to the other. If you mentioned in your question, there may be a loss of jobs in the delivery sector. This may well be the case, but at the same time, there will be new jobs in drone manufacturing, drone operations, drone remote control. There will be new insurance services required. And there will very likely be even new business models that we cannot even think about today, which will potentially create new jobs that we are even completely unaware of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja. To come back to Geert's question, he's clarified by saying he's not so concerned about safety, but more about perceived danger and the delivery mechanisms. His example is, if Amazon drops a package at my doorstep, how does that interaction work with the people on the sidewalk in front of my doorstep? And it's a question that's echoed also by Mario Alves about landing areas. Shouldn't we be clear about sidewalks being used, not being used? Will there be areas that barriers or temporary barriers will be necessary? What about specific groups like blind people?
Maybe I follow up on this, Elisabeth?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I think it's really important to understand that there is some things out there that look fancy on a science fiction movie with packages dropping everywhere and drones landing on your windowsills, whereas what the industry is really planning and thinking about doing. And I think this needs to be clarified, thought through, and discussed. Which is exactly what we do in the report, looking at different use cases and looking also at the differences in the spatial setup of cities. So sometimes some very valuable use cases we've seen in, let's say, Australia, New Zealand, or Africa, where there is not such an urban density, or where the public good of delivering blood samples or medication or other kind of relief goods really outweighs the dangers that are happening, and there is a large enough landing zone if you think of really dropping down a parcel. This is completely different than when you come to an overpopulated or not overpopulated, but a densely populated area like a city. So please take into mind when you ask these questions that there is nobody out there who thinks they are Amazon and drop parcels right on your head. They would not benefit from that. And there have been a lot of very specific use cases where also drones interact with delivery vans on which roofs the drones can land and there deliver the parcel, and then the last mile transport would actually still be developed and handheld to you. So this needs to be a little bit gauged between science fiction ideas and the real use cases that we see. And we address that in the report, particularly, I've seen some of the question is, that's chapter 5, where we look about how to integrate with the transport system overall. And again, we must stress that this is not one regulation size fits for all, but it's very much depending on the spatial and morphological setup of cities across the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katja. We have lots of questions coming in. If I may, group 2 questions. Manon Coyle asks, how do we ensure that drones are only used where needed and that the urban sky is not overpopulated? And if we can tie that into the question from Christiane Webster, who talks about the UTM, the unmanned air traffic management systems, who asks, when exploring policy frameworks for best integrating UTM and drones into urban mobility, what insights can we offer into the pros and cons of a harmonized versus a customized approach by urban centers in the same country? So 2 questions on the actual air management of drones.
Elisabeth, you're right.
I was looking to you, given it's a bit more urban, but I can have a go as well. Just let me know.
Why don't I start and you think so?
Yeah.
Thank you again, and we love it's the typical questions. While we've spent a lot of time on really understanding how UTMs should be set up, how they should be interoperable, what about who should pay for them? These are typical questions that come up, especially the visual amenity over urban centers. So one has to be careful that to understand there is a different approach to private industry versus public good in different areas globally, and to define what is a public good and what is probably just, you know, a big and great push for the market, for the economy, will be to be decided by the national economic and the national structure of how a country is set up, or how the perception of this is set up in, let's say, the US versus Europe. So this is a discussion and it's actively ongoing, and it will be determined by the same questions and same factors and same approaches as we determine other questions when it comes to pertaining of logistical service on the ground. And the second question was balancing a harmonized regulation over a very specific regulation. Again, the most important question here is the urban morphology. So of course you can group, and if cities look very much similar, and if you have, like, let's say, a lot of flat roofs where you can, high-rise flat roofs, where you can land passenger drones, for example, without much interference with people on the ground, then of course it's easier to learn from each other and have a more harmonized regulation between different cities. If you have very different urban morphology, structures, setups, how the city looks, then you have to probably be a lot more specific in your regulations. But this is a very, as we said, a very ongoing discussion between the traditional aviation, the traditional authorities regulating, thinking about the urban or about the airspace and the safety of this, versus now with the large scalability, a potential myriad of landing spaces coming in. So this is thank you all for your questions, because this is one of the key questions that we have discussed and also addressed in our report. Thanks. Do you want to add anything, Elisabeth, on the UTMs?
No, Ronan, maybe go ahead with the next question.
Thank you very much indeed. Question from Sten Vandel. Have you done a comparison with for last mile deliveries between drones, delivery robots for sidewalks, capsule pipelines, cars, vans, bikes, etc.?
Yes, I can take the question. It's fairly easy because I could simply say no. But basically the idea of this report, I guess the 2 points where we compare most the different delivery services and in principle different modes of transport and how to compare with drones is on the cost side of things in the economic chapter, and also on the life cycle assessment in terms of the environmental impacts in the environmental chapter. Here we did not carry out our own research, but we rather brought together the research that already exists and we're relying on that more or less. I don't think I found a study that had such a detailed comparison on all these very innovative services that were mentioned in the study. In the question. But you will find some guidance on these things from the cost side and the environmental sides in the study. I fear, as said, not concerning all these types of transport services that you mentioned, though. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elisabeth. Just for everybody, I'm putting into the chat our link to subscribe to ITF newsletters and other projects to stay up to date in the work that we do on drones and on other cutting-edge transport topics. There are 2 questions about the role of local authorities. Basil O'Fee mentions that they are undertaking a similar study in the UK and have realized that local authorities will be playing a big role in facilitating, and also open source solutions will be preferable to proprietary solutions that lock out other users, including ground infrastructure. International and national bodies also have a role in setting the ground rules, and then local authorities will need to manage on a city or regional type basis. Do either of you have a comment on that, on the role of local authorities?
I think we've said exactly on this topic, we've answered a few questions. It's great to see that in the UK you come to similar conclusions that we have in the working group. We had wonderful representatives from the UK in our working group. Thanks again, especially I'm thinking of you, Ian Macbeth. Yes, it's also one of the things that we wanted to stimulate with this working group, the understanding of the large regulatory aviation bodies, that they have to understand that they now interact with different regulatory bodies and that it's not all being able to be run on a national level. We've seen, and we've discussed that in the previous report, that many countries, France, Spain, have set up already drone councils where the public or the regulators interact with industry and different kinds of industry, so not only drone industry, but as Elisabeth said, insurance companies and so forth. And we do think that more and more there is an understanding that you have to integrate and you have to interact with more local authorities who do the master planning, the land use planning on their own cities or regions as well. However, let's not forget, as much as I'm close to urban air mobility or urban planning overall, there are significant use cases where drones can support longer flights, and especially the reaching out to more remote communities and servicing them even in an environmental beneficial comparison to land transport.
Thanks very much, Katja. And as I mentioned there, we'll finish on a question from Pier Paolo Cassola, who we know well. Do we think that the cost of regulating drones thoroughly, which to include safety, noise, infrastructure, if any, may outweigh the benefits that they deliver, especially when this cost-benefit ratio is compared to other modes?
If you compare, if you believe what drone operators tell you today, then the answer is definitely yes. But I guess you have to be a bit wary with the projections that you get from drone operators themselves. However, they do show you business cases where the benefit is very clear, and they tend to include not only the cost of the operating service, but the larger benefits to society in case, for example, a drone would be compared or would replace a car trip on the ground, for example, with a very polluting vehicle. So they tend to come up with these use cases where, from their point of sight, can very easily convince public authorities that there is such services will be beneficial and the cost-benefit ratio will turn out to be positive in favor of the drones. However, we think ideally public authorities would be able to assess these business cases and the specific drone services on a case-by-case basis, and to look into these forecasts very detailed, because into these assessments, as usual, there go many different assumptions, and the assumptions of whether now you replace a bicycle trip with a drone or you replace an SUV trip with a drone will turn out to be very different, of course. So again, here this is a demand on the policymakers, so to say, to be very vigilant and to put the right policies in place that make sure that potential future drone services replace the type of transport. First of all, that they do not add additional activity where not necessary. And secondly, replace those transport trips where they actually make sense and are beneficial to the wider public.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. To stay within our format, we'll wrap it up there. Huge thanks to both Elisabeth and Katja for the report and for your insights. Thank you very much to Onde Mounier, who's running the technical side for us in the background here. This is not the end, of course, of our work on drones and other areas. Our Secretary General, Yuntae Kim, Secretary General of the International Transport Forum, will be delivering the opening keynote address at the 2021 Drone Enabled Symposium on the 13th of April. The link is in the chat, so feel free to register from now, and we'll be bringing further insights as we go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. And it's been a pleasure to be invited back to work with my former colleagues now that I'm moved on to MIT. Thank you very much, and goodbye, Elisabeth, Ronan, and all the attendees. Thank you for joining.